All right, so this is the review for the World History Final Exam. And so I'm just going to go through question by question to tell you basically the main idea that you need to know throughout the whole thing. And this should follow the general order of the review as well. All right, so first thing, looking at the 1689 English Bill of Rights. All right, so that was passed in England, and what that did is it restricted the role of the monarch. So as far as what the monarch could do and achieve, and so really this paved the way for individual rights of people, and of course is going to be the foundation of our Bill of Rights as well. It's very similar to that, and so that's going to help pave the way for more and more freedom as we go on. And then you'll notice as you go through the test as well, these questions don't go in chronological order of events, and so it's going to kind of hop around a little bit. Kind of like the next one is about the British and French policy of appeasement used against Germany going into World War II. And appeasement, of course, the goal was to avoid war at all costs. And so, they just let Hitler have land, like the Sudetenland and the Rhineland. And of course, this empowered Hitler to take even more because it's like, well, they're not stopping me, so I'll just keep going, which was a huge mistake, obviously, that led to World War II. All right, and then going back to the Enlightenment, John Locke. So John Locke, he believed that if a leader of a government became tyrannical, meaning that they were, like a dictator, that you could overthrow them. So he believed in the right of the people to overthrow a government if it becomes oppressive, which is a key point in our own government within our Constitution. And then looking at Montesquieu, also from the Enlightenment, and his influence on the Constitution, he's the one that came up with the idea of checks and balances. So he studied the fall of the Roman Empire and decided that one of the main reasons Rome fell was the fact that there were no checks and balances. You had ultimate power in the hands of the emperor, and it ended up corrupting and of course falling apart. All right, then looking at the American Revolution and why the American colonists thought that taxes were unfair, and this ties back into not only the English Bill of Rights but also the Magna Carta, the whole idea that it can't be taxed without representation in Parliament. So of course that's what they were angry about so that was the change, no taxation without representation. And so that's what they were mainly upset about. And then of course the Declaration of Independence was signed. You should know that Thomas Jefferson is the main author of the Declaration of Independence. And then the order of events. So you need to know the order of the scientific revolution, American Revolution, and stuff like that, and how they followed each other and why. So the scientific revolution came first. And with that, people started questioning things and questioning the way the world works. And then people started questioning the way government works in society, which is the Enlightenment. That's when we start questioning the government and, the ideas of freedom and challenging the ideas of the monarchy and nobility and the idea that social class distinction is a natural thing. And then, of course, that questioning leads to American independence and the American Revolution. So scientific revolution, questioning the world around us, the natural world, which leads to questioning the social world, the way the world is set up by humans, the government, the institutions, the economics, all that kind of stuff. And then that's going to lead to revolutions like the American Revolution. All right, and then looking at the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was the first constitution the U.S. had, and it sucked. And it gave more power to the individual states, and it made an extremely weak national government. But the reason why they did that, you have to understand the context. The reason why they did that is because they're coming away from very oppressive European monarchs, and the fear was so great of a national government, of a ruler becoming so powerful, that they decided to go complete opposite. Let's just weaken the national government to where it hardly does anything and give the states all the power. And so that's why they created the Articles of Confederation, but it of course failed. All right, there'll be some questions with some quotes from different people in history. Just read the quotes carefully. As long as you understand the context, you should be able to answer the question. All right, in 1787, that's when the U.S. Constitution was approved at the Constitutional Convention. So the current Constitution we have was approved in 1787. And then you need to know the idea of federalism. So this is the opposite of basically what we did with the Confederation. So with federalism, the idea is that you have a division between state and national government. but the national government's more powerful. And so, for example, states take care of education. The national government takes care of, international treaties, going to war, trade agreements, things like that. States cannot enter into any kind of agreement like that with an international um, group or anything like that. All right, and then be able to give an example of checks and balances within our government. So just understand basically how checks and balances work. So, for example, if the president and Congress were to pass a bill into law, but that law was unconstitutional, then the Supreme Court would overrule it and could take it out. Or if the president puts forth a bill to Congress, Congress can obviously not vote it in, and things of that sort. So there's that checks and balances there where one branch isn't more powerful than the other. All right, then hopping back into World War II, you need to understand the German strategy of Blitzkrieg, which was overwhelming force, use of overwhelming force. We talked about how they would, send in bombers and bomb everything, and then tons of tanks, and then after that, thousands of soldiers, and just lay waste to everything in their way, and they could take over a country within hours doing that. All right, and then by the time we get to about the middle of 1941, really the last place in Europe that hadn't been taken over by Germany was Great Britain. So Great Britain's the only holdout really in that region, other than your neutral countries like Switzerland, but they don't count. So, and then of course causes of the French Revolution. Obviously, there's going to be several causes to the French Revolution, not just one thing. So first off, taxation. The third estate was the only estate that was taxed, which is all the poor people for the most part. So that wasn't fair. How the monarchy spent tons of money. I mean, they spent like crazy. I talked about Marie Antoinette, how she would gamble away millions of dollars. And then, of course, the ideas of the Enlightenment, coming in, challenging the idea of a strong monarchy and things of that sort. So all that came together into a cocktail that helped destroy the French Revolution. All right, then, of course, understanding the estates in France at that time. So remember, the estates in France are social classes. So the first estate was nobility and things like that, the monarchy. Second estate's the church. And then the third estate is everyone else. So it's also going to be like merchants and stuff like that, but it's also going to be working class people, your peasants down at the bottom. All right, and then the first meeting of the Estates General in 175 years. So the Estates General was France's parliament, basically. But instead of meeting all the time, they only met whenever the king asked them to, and really their only role was to approve or disapprove of a new tax. And so that's really the only power they had. And so the States General met because the king wanted to tax the second estate. Now, obviously, the second estate was going to be really upset about this because they'd never been taxed before. So that's what brought them together, and it's going to bring some of them against the king, of course. All right, and then looking at Napoleon, some accomplishments of Napoleon. So he set Napoleonic Code, which is a set of laws to govern France. He stabilized the economy after the French Revolution and helped bring everything back to order again. And they also created a public education system. The schools there were called lycées. So he did all that. So he did a lot of really good things for France. It was him trying to take over Europe that kind of ruined everything. All right, then how the Russians defeated Napoleon, or Tsar Alexander I, who was the leader of Russia at the time. So I talked about how the Russians really couldn't fight the French head on. So what the Russians did is they would run away, they would retreat, but as they retreated, they burned everything, all their crops, and killed all their livestock, and that's called scorched earth, the scorched earth policy. So you destroy everything, so the army doesn't have any resources from the field or anything like that, from the earth, to continue going, and so they end up starving to death, and of course the winter set in and killed a lot of them. All right, then the attack of Pearl Harbor. Of course, remember that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor because we cut off their oil supply. And then, of course, after the attack of Pearl Harbor, that's when we entered World War II. So that's what caused us to enter World War II on the side of the Allies. And then, of course, remember how we liberated France during World War II. So that was the D-Day invasion, where we started from England and we came across the English Channel and attacked northern France there on the Normandy beaches and freed France. All right, then nationalism. You need to know what nationalism is and, of course, what it does. So remember, nationalism is this idea of feeling unified as a group of people that share a common heritage and culture and language and stuff like that. And you're loyal to your group of people, not necessarily a leader. And so this is going to do things like obviously cause revolutions. It's going to destroy empires. And it's going to change basically the entire social structure of a society. So anything that you see as far as regarding like bringing about independence or breaking down an empire or ousting a tyrannical leader or anything like that is going to be nationalism. All right, go back to World War II, the Battle of the Bulge. So that was Germany's last offensive in World War II on the Western Front there. After that, when they were retreating back to Berlin, and we won the war pretty soon after that. And of course, remember the final solution during the Holocaust, that was Hitler's kind of last-ditch effort to kill all the Jews, and so that's when the killing really ramped up at the death camps like Auschwitz, where they were killing around 6,000 a day. All right, and then Battle of the Coral Sea. So this was in the Pacific, and the historical aspect of this battle really is that it was the first battle ever to use just airplanes flying off aircraft carriers. And so, no battleships or anything like that. It was all fought in the air. And so it's the first time we see a battle like that in history. All right, and then there's going to be several questions about the Industrial Revolution. They're just kind of sprinkled around the test. So you need to understand how the Agricultural Revolution paved the way for the Industrial Revolution. So agricultural revolution is, we talked about it a little bit. It's like when I was telling you about some of the improvements they made for crops, like Jethro's seed drill, which allowed you to drill the seed down into the ground a few inches, and you could plant in rows instead of just throwing the seeds out there. And so because of that, crops grew in stronger. And with more food, so there's more food that's going to end up being grown. With a better food supply, that also means that the price of food on the market is going to be lower, which means it's going to be harder for a farmer to make money farming. And there's also not as big of a need for as many farmers because there's so much food now in the marketplace. So now a lot of these farmers are selling off their land and they're moving to the city looking for jobs, and that's where you see these factories begin to develop and stuff like that. And so that's what really fuels the Industrial Revolution is, okay, well, there's no money in farming anymore. We have enough food. We don't need as many farmers. Now what are we going to do with these extra people? Well, now we can go into mass production and build these factories, and they can work in factories and make more money in the factory. And so that's how the Agricultural Revolution led to the Industrial Revolution. All right, and as far as why the Industrial Revolution started in Britain, of all places. And so Britain just had everything really going for it at this particular time. They had all the resources they need and technology they needed there. They had the right economic conditions. Their economy was strong. It was pretty easy to get a business loan at the time and build a factory. So everything was working well. And then politically, it was stable. Socially, again, everything was good. So basically, they had all what we call the factors of production. They had the natural resources they needed. They had the rivers in order to transport goods and also power the plants and stuff like that. They had access to coal. They had the capital, which is the money base. They had a skilled working force that was willing and able to work and stuff like that. So everything came together for Britain at that particular time in history. All right, and then the Industrial Revolution, its impact on cities. I mean, obviously, at first, there's going to be incredibly high pollution, high crime rates. Keep in mind the working conditions were horrible, so and people are moving in so fast, the cities can't plan for all these people, and so that's going to lead to a really bad, basically no building codes, no city planning, and so there's buildings that literally collapse on people, stuff like that. So it was really dirty. Especially with pollution and things of that sort. So everything was pretty bad. But the big thing really is just not being able to keep up with the housing supply. So I mean, people are moving in so fast, they just kind of threw together some kind of shelter for themselves. All right, and then things that came out of the Industrial Revolution, there's, of course, good and bad things that came out. But some of the good things were better educational opportunities for more people. The average worker, their living conditions did go up overall. And then consumer goods were more affordable because now they're mass-produced, and if there's more of them, they're going to be cheaper. So really a lot of things did change for the better, but you kind of had to go through a lot of crap to get to that point. All right, then laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire, that basically means, if you can think of another way to remember it, maybe it would be like lazy. What this means is the government does not intervene in the economy. So if the economy collapses, the government's not going to do anything to help prop up the economy. So they just, basically the theory is that the economy will work itself out through natural fluctuations of the market. So if you just leave it alone, then everything works out better. Whereas if the government steps in, they may mess it up, they may slow it down, stuff like that. So just better just to leave it alone. And then looking at socialists in the 19th century, as far as their idea of government, they, of course, wanted the government to more plan out the economy, to actively plan it. And of course, the idea is then you wouldn't have to worry about the natural fluctuations that can happen in a free market, like the stock market crash in 1929. And so they would argue that actually, if you have more government control, then you could alleviate the chances of a crash. All right, you need to know the tie between the Industrial Revolution and imperialism. So remember, imperialism is when European countries like England and France and Germany and Italy and Spain and all those went around the world finding colonies, so taking over parts of Africa and Latin America and stuff like that, and Middle East. And of course, they're looking for resources, because to fuel the Industrial Revolution, you need resources to fuel it. And you got to find those somewhere else because you don't have enough in your country. So during that time in history, the more colonies you had, the richer you were automatically. That's why the British were the most powerful, is because they had the most colonies, and they had the richest colonies, providing them with tons of materials. All right, so also remember, too, when you're looking at economics, that, again, a communist government the government's going to own all the means of production, which means they own all the factories, they own all the land, they own all the natural resources. There is no private property. Everything's controlled by the government. Of course, in a free market economy or free enterprise, you can see both words, both terms. It means there is private ownership and things of that sort. And obviously, we have a free enterprise system. All right, then the idea of manifest destiny, you should remember that from U.S. history. Of course, that's the idea that it was the U.S.'s destiny to control everything from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And so, of course, that justified westward expansion into the frontier regions of the country. And then going into the Civil War, leading up to it, what caused the secession of the southern states, what event? And it was the election of Abraham Lincoln. So once Lincoln was elected and won that election, then the southern states knew that a lot of the rights and freedoms that they wanted were going away, including the right to own slaves, and so that's when they seceded from the Union. All right, then after the Civil War, we had the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendments passed. You need to know what each one did. So the 13th Amendment is what freed the slaves. So the slaves were freed by the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, there we go. All right, so the 14th Amendment, that made African Americans citizens of the United States, and the 15th Amendment gave the right to vote to male blacks. Of course, remember at that time, no women could vote no matter what, so white women couldn't vote either at that time. So 13th freed the slaves, 14th made them citizens, 15th gave them the right to vote. All right, and then inventions during the 19th century. So remember, 19th century is the 1800s. So some major inventions came out, such as the car and telephone, of course, electricity, stuff like that. And that made our lives easier and our way of living much easier than what it was before. So basically, the inventions in the 1800s, early 1900s really led to an easier, more comfortable lifestyle than what we have lived for the previous several thousand years. All right, so as far as reasons why imperialism began, so again, we talked about the need for raw materials, for resources to help fund the Industrial Revolution, and then also too they wanted to gain more colonies, of course, to be more powerful, to gain more strength as well, which I basically mentioned. And then also the other reason too is that they abolished slavery. So once they got rid of slavery, and you couldn't take slaves from Africa and work on plantations in the Americas, then you basically, the next step was like, well, if we can't enslave them, we'll just take over their countries and then force them to work for us. So it's still a form of enslavement. It's just without having to actually take them from their country. It's just, forcing them to work in their own country. All right, then the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 85. This one was very important. So basically, Africa had been divided up among European nations, but not evenly, and this is creating a lot of tension between European countries. And the fear was this would bring about a massive war within Europe. And so in Berlin during that time, they took out, all the leaders met together, and they basically took out a map of Africa and divided it up among themselves. And they did it to prevent a war in Europe. They obviously didn't care about Africa. So they put all kinds of tribes in Africa together that hated each other. The Europeans created ethnic groups like the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda and pitted them against each other. So the whole point of the Berlin Conference was to avoid a war in Europe and make sure that Africa was more evenly divided. There's also a few political cartoons. Again, just make sure you look at those carefully and just keep in mind the context in which the cartoon is in to help you answer the question. All right, and then of course why Japan surrendered at the end of World War II. Obviously, that's because we dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And of course, remember, we did that because we believed that it would save more lives by doing that. And also bring the war to a quick end before Russia could get involved. And then the Suez Canal, you need to know where that is. So the Suez Canal connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. It goes through Egypt, right, in between like the main part of Egypt and then over to where the Sinai Peninsula is. There's a skinny part of land, an isthmus, where they cut the canal through. And so the canal was built, but basically, well, it was funded by the French and the British, but they mainly obviously made Egyptians dig it out and stuff like that. But the British controlled that canal for a long time, giving them control of the seas. All right, and then as far as the amount of people killed in World War II, and this is including civilians and, of course, the people in the Holocaust and all that, the total was about 60 million, so that makes it the deadliest war by far in all of world history. And probably, honestly, it probably killed more people in that war than we did in the previous 1,000 years of fighting. All right, then the Nuremberg trials after the war. This is where we put 22 Nazi leaders on trial. We put them on trial for war crimes against humanity, so obviously for genocide against the Jews and other groups deemed inferior. And then you need to remember in the Kristallnacht, which was the night when outward persecution of Jews really spilled over. That was in 1938. And then after that's where we really started seeing Jews pushed into the ghettos and then off to concentration camps, and people were more okay with persecuting Jews in public. All right, then you know who Francisco Franco is, and I barely mentioned him. So he was the dictator over Spain from 1923 to 1930. So yeah, there's really not much else you need to know on that though. All right, then going into World War I, you know what the Triple Alliance was? So the Triple Alliance was Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And this was an alliance they had way before World War I, actually. It went back and forth. But as you go into World War I, that's the main alliance system we fought. And, of course, our side, the one that we were on, was called before we got into it, though, it was called the Triple Entente. All right, the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century. So during that time, we saw ourselves, the United States, we saw ourselves as basically the international police force of the Western Hemisphere. And so we told European countries, you're not allowed to imperialize or take over any part of Latin America. And if you try, we're going to go to war against you. So the first time this was tested was Spain. So this is what caused the Spanish-American War in 1898. And we kicked the Spanish out of the Western Hemisphere at that point. And that's how we got Puerto Rico. All right, so going into World War I, you need to know the underlying causes. Remember, underlying causes are things that are festering for a long time. So the underlying causes, first off, are imperialism. So, trying to look out for different colonies and get the most colonies you could get. Then, of course, the alliance system as well, because one alliance system may be stronger than the other. And then nationalism, this idea of wanting self-determination, be able to control your own country and thinking you're better than anyone else. And then, of course, militarism, the build up the military. As one country builds up their military, other countries are going to do the same. All right, then the Schlieffen Plan. So the Schlieffen Plan in World War I was Germany's plan to attack France first and destroy them first, and then quickly regroup and go to the Eastern Front and hit Russia. And, of course, this failed miserably. Then unrestricted submarine warfare, of course, was the German policy of shooting down, sinking any boat in British waters, didn't matter what boat it was. And their goal here was to get at the U.S. because they knew we were secretly giving the British weapons and money, and so they were trying to keep that from reaching the British. And then women during World War I, like World War II, they worked in factories and really kept the economy going at that time, so they were key in allowing us to continue in war. And then the Zimmerman Note and getting us involved in World War I. So, of course, the sinking of Lusitania made us really upset. And the Zimmerman Note was the last thing that we're like, okay, that's it, we're going to war. And really the promise was, Germany promised Mexico that if they would declare war on the United States, that Germany would help Mexico regain its territory it lost beforehand. So it'd help them regain Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California. And, of course, after that, we're like, that's it, Germany, we're going to war. All right, Treaty of Versailles. So remember how the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, that's really what created a lot of bitterness and hatred in Germany because they got blamed for the war. They had to pay all these war reparations that destroyed their economy. And so this is what's going to help fuel the rise of Hitler later on. All right, and then joining the League of Nations, Americans were not happy about that at all. Remember, the U.S. in the early 20th century was isolationist, meaning that we wanted to stay out of the world's problems. We're geographically isolated from the rest of the world, so who cares? Like, just let them figure it out. That's their problem. We don't need to be involved in that. Because, we were still a young country, and, we're growing tremendously, and we had a lot of problems we needed to deal with at home. All right, so as far as after World War One, there was a lot of push to ban war, and so we talked about like the Kellogg-Briand um, treaty, which basically the idea was to end war and things like that. But the problem is the League of Nations, which would be the ones that would enforce it, is how can you enforce a ban on war? Because you can't use force. You can't say like you can't go to war. We're going to invade because obviously that's war. So the problem was there's nothing to really back it up. There's what are you going to threaten with? And so there's no way to actually keep that going. And then, of course, again, remember that the Treaty of Versailles is going to lead to a bunch of anger in Germany, which is going to lead to the rise of fascism in Germany as well as in Italy. All right, and then Russia, the impact of World War I on Russia. So they lost 5 million soldiers in the first 3 years of that war, and so they pulled out of World War I, and that ended up leading into a civil war, which brought about the Communist Revolution. And so they pulled out of that. All right, and then, of course, the Communist Revolution in Russia obviously set up communism in Russia, so that's when the USSR started. It was from the revolution in 1917, of course, fell in 1991. And then as far as events that led the Soviet Union to becoming a totalitarian state. So remember, totalitarianism is when a country has full, complete, total control over every aspect of your life, everything going on. And so some events that happened in Russia during that time to lead to a totalitarian state is the 5-year plans, for example, that Stalin instituted on the economy, which set really high quotas and forced people to work really hard. Forcing people onto collective farms to work there. A lot of people don't want to go to, end up killing millions of people, which is also the Great Purge. Anybody that was like an enemy of the state, millions of people were killed or sent off to gulags, which are the prison camps in Siberia. So all of that are examples of Russia transforming to a totalitarian state. All right, and then the new technology in World War I. So we talked about how they had all these new weapons and stuff like that, but it didn't help the war go faster. People thought war would end quicker because of these new weapons, but instead we just killed a lot more people, but war lasted just as long, and so it just ended up having a lot more bloodshed than we've ever had before. All right, and then there's going to be some more quotes again. So just understand in general Gandhi and his idea of nonviolent resistance or nonviolent disobedience. And so, he believed that you could get freedom, that India could gain its freedom without fighting, that you could do it peacefully. And so he's trying to prove that point, that you can peacefully achieve a revolution without bloodshed, at least without you being the one going out there and killing. The other side may kill you, but you don't have to fight back. All right, and then you need to, of course, remember why a lot of people were angry at the British after World War I. When I say people, I mean like their colonies. So remember, the British promised their colonies more freedom, if not complete freedom, if they would help fight in World War I. And the British didn't do that. Actually, they actually took more control over their colonies, which obviously is going to make them upset. It's going to cause a lot of distrust, which still continues to this day in the Middle East, at least especially among like your terrorist organizations where they still remember this kind of stuff and are still angry about it. All right, then the effect World War I would have on literature and art. So after World War I, people had never seen a war like that. And so this caused a lot of people to be disillusioned about the world, to have pretty much no faith in humanity. What's the purpose of life? Why are we here? Like, just what is going on, basically, is what came out of that. All right, and then of course, the beginning of the Great Depression that started with the stock market crash in 1929. Of course, that's not the underlying causes of the Great Depression, but it's the event that spurred the beginning of it. And then another question on appeasement. We've already talked about that. Again, we talked about totalitarian governments. Of course, Nazi Germany was totalitarian, so was fascist Italy under Mussolini, and of course, Stalinist Russia. All those are totalitarian. North Korea is totalitarian today. All right, and then if you were to compare and contrast Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini as far as leaders go, so they're both fascists. So obviously they're going to strike fear into their people. They're going to hate communism. They're going to want to expand their territory and things like that. But the big difference is, though, is that Hitler blamed a lot of the problems in Germany on the Jews, whereas Mussolini never did that. He never really picked a particular group of people to blame for their problems. All right, and then looking at fascism and communism and comparing those, they do have some things in common where you have like a one-party system, no human rights, things like that. But the big difference is that in communism, the goal is a classless society; everyone's equal. In fascism, that's not true. Fascism, you have two parties: you have the ruling class and the class that's being ruled. Think of it again like natural selection, considering that Hitler used the ideas of social Darwinism. So the idea is that the ruling class is basically like the alpha in the pack, and then everyone else is, the ones that follow. All right, then as far as what started World War II officially, as far as France and Great Britain declaring war on Germany, and that's when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. So that's what started World War II. And then, again, more questions about the Industrial Revolution, just again understand that people are moving to cities during that time. And then the Lend-Lease Act, that's when we gave money and weapons to allies that were considered important to us. And, of course, that helped our economy as well. So we kind of made money off the war. All right, then also World War II, Battle of Midway. This is in the Pacific. Midway is an island that's midway between the U.S. and Japan. And the key is this was a turning point in the war in the Pacific when we actually started beating the Japanese. So up until this point, we were losing against Japan. Once we beat them at the Battle of Midway, then we were on the march and Japan began losing ground. All right, and then another question about the final solution. All right, then the Battle of Stalingrad. So the Germans were winning that battle during the summer, but then as the winter set in, Russian troops were reinforced, and also the Russian winter really wreaked havoc on the Germans and allowed the Russians to defeat the Germans, which is a big reason why they lost World War II. And as far as how civilians took part in the war effort during World War II, we've talked about all this. So, of course, rationing things. They worked in war industries and helped develop goods for the war. They did scrap metal drives, bonds, all kinds of stuff to help raise money and support the war and get materials to the war. And then displaced people after World War II. So there's a lot of reasons why there were displaced people after World War II. One is going to be border changes. A lot of border changes occurred, especially in Eastern Europe, after the end of World War II. And so, maybe you were, I think of a good example. Let's say you were in Poland, and then all of a sudden the border changed, and now you're in Ukraine or something like that. Point is, the borders changed everywhere. And so maybe you're in a new country now. That's where your house is. And so now you got to become a citizen of that new country. And then, of course, you have refugees from all over the place, from the Soviet Union, of course, the people that survived the Holocaust and stuff like that, they have no place to go. And also, you even have people that fled the Soviet army that didn't want to go back to Russia, so they're like, oh, we're out of here. We're going to stay in Italy or Germany. And so you had people that did that. And so because, you had millions of people, and this caused a lot of starvation and things of that sort. All right, there's some chart questions. If you can read a chart, you can answer the questions. It's not hard. All right, and then Winston Churchill, he talked about the Iron Curtain. This after World War II, going into the Cold War. So the Iron Curtain basically, of course, it's not a real thing. It's just a analogy. And so he basically was saying that as a representation of the division between communism in Eastern Europe and then the capitalism in Western Europe. So division between East and West. And then our policy during the Cold War, our main foreign policy when it came to communism is containment. So to contain communism where it was. We didn't want it spreading around the world because we believed the communism was like a cancer. The main theory at that time was called the domino theory, which meant that when one country falls to communism, then the surrounding countries are going to fall. And just like dominoes, they eventually all fall. And so that was our fear. Map question, again, read a map and you're good. All right, you know the connection of the Bay of Pigs failed invasion of Cuba and then the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we trained Cuban nationals that have fled to the U.S. to go back and invade Cuba and try to overthrow Fidel Castro. And it failed miserably. It made us look really stupid. And so Russia thought, and the leader at that time was Khrushchev, and he thought that since we were so weakened at that time and we really didn't have any ability to do anything around Cuba at that point, that they could move missiles and set them up in Cuba. Well, that, of course, led to the Cuban Missile Crisis and us opposing the Soviets putting missiles there, and eventually we got them removed. All right, again, more questions about the Industrial Revolution. You should be good on that. All right, then understand why we went from the policy of brinksmanship during the Cold War to detente. So brinksmanship was that really dumb policy I talked about, how like we'll go to the brink of war if there's a threat, but the problem is what is a threat and what is the brink of war. But the point is we're going to be offensive, like we're ready to act. Whereas in detente, that's after Vietnam. So after Vietnam, really just American people just didn't see communism as a threat anymore. It's like, why are we doing this? Can't we just end this conflict and find peace? And so detente was seeking that peace out and creating that peace. So that's basically lessening the tensions with the Soviet Union. All right, more about the Industrial Revolution. All right, and then this one didn't exactly hit yet. So the Industrial Revolution, obviously, working conditions are really bad. Well, this is also going to lead to the rise of socialism because working conditions are so horrible. So socialism is going to bring, more rights for the worker and things of that sort. All right, and then again, another question on imperialism in Europe during the 19th century. And of course, one of the other good things about getting colonies for the European countries is not only to get access to raw materials, but it's also new markets to sell their goods, because you only sold your goods to your colonies. You weren't allowed to sell them to other countries' colonies. So the more colonies you have, the bigger market you have to sell your stuff. All right, so remember again, in the free enterprise system, that the means of production, they're privately owned, meaning that private individuals own them. Means of production is things like natural resources, capital, land, things like that. All right, and then apartheid. So remember in South Africa, apartheid was the segregation of the races, whites and blacks. And that did not end until 1994 when Nelson Mandela was elected president and brought an end to apartheid. All right, then perestroika. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union is falling apart, and then Mikhail Gorbachev tried to initiate some policies to help save the Soviet Union. So perestroika was trying to revive the Soviet economy. He was trying to bring in some elements of capitalism. And so basically a free market economy to help encourage growth, but it did not work. It's too little, too late. Another political cartoon on the Cold War and how the fall of the Soviet Union there. And then a commercial that we'll skip right now. Cool. All right. Just two more. All right, so let's see what this one's talking about. Okay, well, it was a political cartoon, so I won't go over that. All right, so the last one then, Adam Smith. Adam Smith, back in the Enlightenment, he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, and he believed that the best economic system is a free enterprise system. And a truly free one. He didn't believe in any kind of government intervention whatsoever. You'll learn about him in economics your senior year, I would assume, and you'll learn about his theory that he called, this idea he called the invisible hand. So he believed that there's this invisible hand that guided the economy. All that means is just that the economy goes through natural fluctuations, and you can basically predict it for the most part. But you need to leave it alone so that invisible hand can work itself out. So that's Adam Smith, and that's it. So again, I pretty much followed the review. There might be a few on the review that you're looking at that may have kind of skipped, and the only reason I would have skipped it is because I felt like I talked about it enough on previous questions for you to be able to answer those questions. So watch this video as many times as you can to help make sure you do a really good job. So again, just a reminder as far as how much this impacts your grade. For every 5 points generally above or below your average that you score on the exam, your grade changes a point. So if you have a 90 and you get an 85 on this exam, you'll go down to an 89. And of course, remember, as I said in class, I will bump your grade depending on what I've seen holistically throughout the year. If I think you've worked hard and done makeup tests and really have put forth an effort, then you get that bonus. All right, so if you have any questions, feel free to come into tutoring, shoot me emails, anything like that, and good luck on the test.